Hey, I'm Dexter. A little while ago I made a casual look at Borderlands 3. And as most casual look-ats are, this was essentially just my impressions of Borderlands 3. This primarily concerned things like how it works as a sequel, how it compares to Borderlands 2, and just if I find it enjoyable or not in general. I've played a little bit more of Borderlands 3 at this point, and I want to talk a little bit about this series in general, honestly. Including Borderlands 3, Borderlands the pre-sequel, and Borderlands 2. And potential future installments to the series as well. Well, that's a quick introduction to what the ramblings in this video will be about. Complementing the commentary will just be a bit of Borderlands 3 footage in the background. To start with, I'd like to mention a few things that I didn't really talk about when covering Borderlands 3. And the reason I didn't do that was because this doesn't really pertain to Borderlands 3 specifically, but more so to the Borderlands series as a whole. It's also rather difficult to remember to cover and discuss every single aspect of a game in a live video impressions, without having it become incredibly long and rambly. Anyways, enough explaining, let's just jump right in. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the loot system. For the most part, it's absolutely fine. It's relatively simple, certainly not particularly hard to use or understand. It's relatively satisfying to see the weird kind of crazy weapons you can get and all the wonderfully colored loot, but it has a few problems as far as I'm concerned. One such problem is the idea of junk tier loot, which in this case essentially encompasses all the white tier weapons and shields for that matter. In the absolute majority of cases, you might as well just integrate a quick sell button for this kind of loot. Because, unless it's at least green or higher, you generally just will not use it because it's simply not useful. It doesn't do enough DPS to be worthwhile. Now there's a few reasons why I don't particularly like this. One is that you still have to pick up all these weapons to be even slightly efficient economically. And while yes, you could make the argument that, well, just don't pick the weapons up. But at the same time, well, it's absolutely encouraged to do so because you can sell them. And then you will be able to buy actually useful weapons. So it is highly encouraged to actually pick them up. There's no question about that. That is, bar none, the most efficient strategy. And while there's always an argument of, well, you don't have to power game, obviously, if you don't want to, yeah, that's correct. This is accurate. However, from a game design standpoint, it is not advisable to make the most efficient and effective way to play the most boring one. That's just not a good way to design your game, essentially ever. What you would like to do as a game designer is to promote the most interesting and fun way to play the game, of course. Now, there is a bit of a scale on this. You could have a grind/reward system, which many RPGs have, for example. But as far as I'm concerned, in this case, optimally, 1, the grinding should be at least fun or somewhat enjoyable, and 2, it should not be monotonous, which picking up weapons, running back to the shop, selling them, rinse, repeat, absolutely is. And it's also by no means interesting or challenging. It's just busy work. It's also one thing if you actively go out of your way to try and farm for loot or XP, or if this is very, very obviously and clearly the most efficient way to do something. If you play a game where you run back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to the dungeon to collect all the loot you can't carry, well, that's not really how it's intended to be played, nor is it particularly encouraged. In Borderlands, on the other hand, every single level starts off with a shop or some kind of vending machine where you can sell all your items. Additionally, throughout the level there's usually a number of vending machines scattered throughout as well, where you can sell additional weapons you gathered throughout your run. On top of this, most weapons still has a reasonable value and isn't particularly hard to really fit into your inventory as long as you expand it to some degree, meaning that the collection and selling of all these random common tier weapons isn't necessarily particularly unviable or clearly discouraged, it's just a bit tedious. But still kinda seems to be the way it's supposed to be played. At least if you want to be at least moderately efficient. Again, it's not even close to being anything like a exploit or any kind of convoluted strategy to maximize your economic income or anything like that. It's just a very obvious way of making use of the loot that's clearly distributed and available on the level. Essentially, I'm fine with this being an option, but it shouldn't feel like the default way to play the game. Okay, so let's move on to the second sort of unfortunate consequence of this, which is that all the kind of trash tier items, they still have a unique model, animation, sound effect, design, etc. And they're actually rather decent. They're kind of derelict, rusty, kind of wasteland themed weapons. They're really quite cool, and I never get to use them because they're bad. Which is a little bit of an unfortunate waste, as far as I'm concerned. Why even bother putting down time and energy modeling weapons, animating weapons, designing weapons that you're just never gonna use? It just seems like a little bit of a waste, doesn't it? Don't get me wrong though, this is not me saying that I don't like the insane legendary techno weapons, just that I also like the weathered, patched together wasteland weapons. And it would be nice if they had some legitimate use, as opposed to essentially amounting to valuables or cell tokens. Maybe you could have some kind of special mode or challenge run or something like that. I don't know. My second largest problem with the gameplay of Borderlands is repetitive combat. Now initially this might come off as somewhat counterintuitive, and I would agree. Considering the incredibly large amount of different weapons in Borderlands, that surely shouldn't be a problem. But there's a few reasons why this is the case for me, and I would like to try and explain that. One is that while there is a very large amount of different weapons, many of them will handle in similar ways. Additionally, the combat is usually not particularly strategically complex, usually amounting to shoot the enemy and duck into cover when your shields are down, sometimes complemented with a bit of circle strafing, especially in the boss fights, preferably while scoring critical hits. You may also use the quote-unquote strategy of trying to run right up to a almost dead enemy when you are about to die in order to try to secure a second wind. Otherwise, that's more or less the extent to which the strategical complexity reaches. Additionally, the loadout that you have is not specified, so you cannot assume that the player will have any certain specific weapon at any given time, limiting the way you can design weapon requirements for enemies. And on top of this, the enemy AI is probably what I describe as relatively mediocre. That being said, none of these are deal breakers, nor are they excessively prevalent or pronounced. So there is of course a few other problems that exacerbate the issue. One of which is a very personal problem, which is honestly that I've just played a very large amount of Borderlands in general. And counting off the time I've spent with both Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel, that's probably up to a few hundred hours. Most of which probably having been spent in this combat system. And since it isn't particularly strategic or difficult, it can get a bit mundane and repetitive after a while. And unfortunately, the gameplay isn't particularly helped by the respawn system either, which I'm also not especially fond of, at least not anymore. But I suppose I ought to elaborate on that. I think the respawn system is quite clearly designed for a particular purpose in mind. Impose some degree of limited punishment, but also provide an easy way to jump right back into the action. Something that is rather desirable for a cooperative experience where you're supposed to mainly screw around and have fun. And since the focus isn't really put on providing a semi-tactical challenge, as it is in something like Left 4 Dead, bringing people back into the action with their friends is considered much more important, making designs that imposes considerable time or cost penalties counterproductive. Hence the current system of instantaneous respawn with a minor fee. This system does of course have some drawbacks as well, of course, one of which being lessened stakes. This isn't really something I would consider a major problem for the co-op component of the game, problem being, if you are playing in single player, this is rather unsatisfying. Another design decision that I would assume stems from the co-op respawn system results in that since you are usually going to have a friend in the level can't reset. This dichotomy is maintained in the single player as well, meaning that you can go into a level, kill a few enemies, die, and then come back having these enemies stay dead, making the strategy of bashing your head against the wall until it breaks rather viable. Indeed, you have essentially as many attempts as you damn well please, considering the cost of respawning is just a percentage of your total wealth either way. And since the progress between your deaths is maintained as long as it isn't a boss fight, it makes repeatedly dying in a level a viable strategy. Since death is essentially the only failure state Borderlands have, it makes the concept of failure in general in Borderlands incredibly nebulous and insignificant. Now I know some people like these kind of systems, and there are other games that have used similar systems as well, notably System Shock and Bioshock. There were, however, a few differences. In System Shock, for example, you did not have access to one of these respawn points until you discovered one on the level, meaning that if you died before this, you would indeed be dead, necessitating a reload. Additionally, these respawn points would get scarcer as you progressed through the game, essentially being unavailable by the end. Bioshock used a similar system, but also allowed you to disable them altogether. This is not options or functions that are available in Borderlands, independent of whether you play cooperative or single player. So while I certainly don't have anything against the option of having these kind of beginner-friendly and non-punishing mechanics, the choice to opt out for those who would be so inclined, which I would be very much appreciated. Considering I do like to have some kind of greater resemblance of stakes and challenge in my games. Just having the level reset or making me reload a previous save would probably be sufficient. Although given a bit of thought and tinkering, I think a much better system could be conceived. But that more or less brings me to the end of my complaint regarding the gameplay. I would have liked a better stealth system, but that really isn't within the scope of Borderlands to begin with, so that's hardly even relevant. So let's move on to the other things I want to speak about. I do want to point out that the combat of Borderlands has been progressively improving, and the amount of different weapons, equipment, abilities and movement opportunities has continuously increased with each title, which all to its credit I do find rather commendable, and I certainly believe they could have gotten away with doing a lot less if they would have been so inclined. Considering the fact that we have plenty of examples that show that people are willing to pay rather significant amount of money for games that are essentially the same game as the previous title in the series. So credit where it's due, I do find that commendable. And I would also suggest that Borderlands 3 is the game where we take the biggest step in evolving the combat. That being said, however, since I've played Borderlands for such a long time at this point, it still isn't quite enough for me. If we would have skipped the pre-sequel or if this combat system was present there and would have continuously evolved from there, then that might have been enough, yes. But by this point I really need a rather substantial amount of reiteration and renewal to keep it interesting, frankly. Again, because it isn't particularly difficult, and it isn't particularly complex, and it's not particularly strategic. It's kind of just part of the course by this point. You're doing the same thing, you're not innovating, you're not evolving in your strategy or how you tackle the game. There isn't really much to change in your approach. It really just is go in guns blazing. That's the most effective way to tackle enemies. It can still be reasonably fun for a little while, it absolutely can, but I do quickly tire of it by this point. And I have to take much more consistent breaks and pauses in the gameplay, because it's just not engaging for longer periods of time. But anyways, I think it's about enough rambling about the state of the combat at this point. So let's sort of move on to the second part of this, which is by far my biggest issue with the game currently, which is the story, dialogue and writing. It's frankly really quite bad. I do not like it at all, and it hasn't improved, it hasn't gotten better, it's gotten worse. I'm going to primarily focus on Borderlands 2, the pre-sequel, and Borderlands 3, because 1, I feel those are the ones that are most connected, 2, they are the most recent, and 3, they are the ones I have the most experience with. I guess there's sort of two components of this. One is primarily comedy, and the other is the story aspect. but since they are interconnected there is going to be overlap between the two. I think it's easiest to start with a comedy, because I can quite simply say it's not really my taste. A lot of the humor is very much on the nose, rather puerile and just not particularly innovative and funny for the most part. Although I have to say, this issue has been exacerbated in the later titles. The idea to use a exaggerated or ludicrous character like, say, Marcus, Dr. Zed or Ellie as a source of comedy does hold some merits, and is a source of comedy commonly utilized in the Borderlands franchise. And sometimes they hit the mark for me as well. The problem with these kind of characters is that they usually have a certain kind of expiration date in a sense. Since the comedy usually comes from the surprising stupidity or ludicry of the characters, keeping them around for long periods of time lessens this effect. And after a while it becomes expected, predictable and part of the course, making their antics much less funny and surprising. At this point you'll usually have to do one of two different things. Well, at least if you want to keep up the quality of the writing, dialogue and story. 1. You add substance, depth and charm to the character. Or 2. You do away with them and introduce a new character that is different and interesting in some other way. And Borderlands 3 especially does a absolutely horrible job with this. They bring back old characters, but at this point they are much less funny, their exaggerated traits has gotten a bit stale, and some of their stupid or silly traits has actually been suppressed to signify growth, which frankly doesn't work with these kind of characters, and none of them have really been particularly fleshed out or made more complex, still being very one-note and flat. Meanwhile, most new characters are played either rather straight-faced, almost being depicted as badass role models, or a reiteration of a previously done trope or joke that can be found in a previous game. Stupid random bollocks and exaggerations can only stay funny for so long, and they certainly don't bear repeating. And at this point, even the good parts of Borderlands start to get a bit stale. I don't know if they're starting to run low on new ideas, but the amount of dialogue and background shattering certainly hasn't decreased. And it honestly seems to be more in Borderlands 3 than it was in Borderlands 2. Although that might just be perception because it's getting increasingly obnoxious. Not only because it's starting to get very repetitive, but it's also often worse. Now, I'm not going to claim that Borderlands 3 is completely bereft of comedy, and there still are instances of clever or amusing writing that even a cynical bore like me can find entertaining, even though it's an instance that seems to get increasingly infrequent. With all this being said, humor is something that is incredibly subjective, and it may well be that many still find Borderlands to be utterly hilarious. And as previously admitted, I've never been a particularly big fan of Borderlands comedy in general. It just isn't particularly my taste. Even then, I do feel the points of amusement are getting increasingly rare. But since it is so incredibly subjective, I don't believe me prattling on about it is going to be particularly productive. So let's move on to the narrative instead. Unfortunately, I can't say the performance here is particularly stellar either. Now, the story has never really been the selling point of Borderlands. I don't think that is a particularly controversial statement. But with that said, there was of course a certain aspect of Borderlands 2's writing which managed to garner a decent amount of praise. Which of course was the character Handsome Jack. This was, and is, as far as I'm concerned, well deserved. As he is, in my opinion, one of the most unique, interesting and obnoxious characters in gaming history. At least so far. He is incredibly narcissistic, petty and entirely morally bankrupt. On top of this, he's an opportunist, ridiculously rich, and head of one of the most powerful corporations in the Borderlands universe. He was incredibly well written in Borderlands 2 and essentially carried the whole story. The pre-sequel stumbled somewhat, but still maintained a certain degree of intrigue. The idea to tell the backstory of Handsome Jack, considering his popularity, certainly isn't a flawed concept inherently. But as it turned out, we ended up with a bit of a detoothed character. Although I would also suggest that the initial appeal of the concept is somewhat deceptive. And I don't mean intentionally or maliciously deceptive by the developer, as it was a concept I found rather interesting and appealing myself. But I think I came to the realization that one of the reasons Handsome Jack is so interesting is because he's somewhat unexplainable. Or at the very least, unexplained. I have no idea how this absolute jackass and imbecile of a person ended up as the head of one of the most powerful and influential companies in the entire Borderlands universe. And that's a mystery I can somewhat appreciate. You know how a monster almost always gets less scary when it's revealed? Well, it's a bit of a similar concept. When you don't know something, it's very easy to imagine the most insane and elaborate plans and circumstances for how something came about. In order to top this, you'll need a pretty damn good story. So unless you have something really bloody good, it might be better to just leave it be. The story they came up with for their pre-sequel isn't really terrible by any means. It's mostly just safe, predictable and unoriginal. And since it's a story that takes place before he's a complete megalomaniac, he comes off as a little bit more toned down and muted this time around, which reduces some of the appeal of his extremely exaggerated character. That being said, it isn't terrible. It's fine, he still has some of his distinct characteristics, he's still utterly dislikable, he's still certainly recognizable. It's totally fine. He's still recognizable, he has many of his distinct characteristics, he's still utterly dislikable. It gives a bit of the standard motivation of his superiors and officers being assholes. So that part of the story is really mostly fine. The character selection, I suppose, is alright. You get to play as some of the bounty hunters he apparently hired, or Claptrap, because I guess reasons. I guess it's somewhat interesting that Wilhelm is there, although I can't say I was particularly intrigued by that character. It's not like after I defeated him in Borderlands 2, I was thinking, wow, that certainly was an interesting character full of depth. I would love to hear the backstory of him, but whatever. I guess it kind of felt like a minor game that was kind of jammed in between the sequels to bridge the time gap. I didn't really expect as much from that. So adding a bit of backstory for some of the main characters of the second game was likely more or less what they were aiming for. Was it great? Well, it wasn't better than the second one, although to be fair that was somewhat expected, because it was kind of marketed as, well, more of the same. And there was never any pretenses of evolving the story. And the nature of being a prequel to Borderlands 2 somewhat necessitates the use of the same characters, which gives them a bit of a pass on that one as well. That doesn't necessarily mean I like it, but it's understandable. Borderlands 3, being a less directly connected continuation, certainly could have taken the opportunity to refine and improve on the storytelling and structure. And it would be nice to know some sort of limitations, or if there is any kind of limitations to how, for example, Sirens and Iridium works. You know, to kind of avoid the Deus Ex Machina shit. You could also focus on things like, say, introducing more fleshed out and interesting characters. Perhaps even expanding a bit on the lore and the backstory of some of these really interesting companies like Dahl, Jacobs or Malivan. And I don't just mean give stupid, silly stories connected to the companies, but actually, you know, deepening their story, explaining their motives, the company's motives. Not just the motive of a singular person or singular leader and CEO in these companies, but the company itself, how it works, how it's structured, how it came about. Because as far as I'm concerned, these incredibly large, powerful, wealthy, multi-conglomerate corporate empires probably hold potential for some of the most interesting faction-based storytelling in the whole Borderlands universe. Did Borderlands 3 do any of this? No. In fact, it's worse. They've brought back some of the old characters, although this time around they're even more flat and uninteresting. Some of them have lost their edge and been reduced down to very stereotypical boring shit. Removing certain quirks of the characters, for example, like reducing or toning down insecurities and flaws. making them just incredibly boring and uninteresting overall. Like Ellie, who's just really tough, no insecurities whatsoever and knows exactly what she wants. That's fun. Or Lilith, which seems to have no flaws at all. Okay, great. Same pretty much goes for Maya. Other characters are essentially exactly the same, having seen no evolvement whatsoever. Meaning they are really starting to outstay their welcome and being very worn out at this point. Usually because they were rather simple stereotypes in the first place. For example, Marcus, who is a greedy corporate bastard. Okay, great, I get it. So, oh, that's it. This was kind of okay in Borderlands 2, but it's getting really fucking old at this point. You can't continue with these forever, you do get that, right? These kind of characters do have a shelf life. So, are the new characters any better? Of course not! They are, quite frankly, absolutely entirely obnoxious and uninteresting in every single way. Let's just very quickly describe a few of them, shall we? We have an obnoxious teenager, who have had a tough upbringing. As such, she is overly insecure, consistently overcompensates, and tries to play tough. But of course fails miserably. But I'm just going to predict this here, she is going to be important in the end anyways. Let's see if that's how it turns out. Well, that was certainly inspired and original. Let's see who else we have. We have a idiot CEO. Never seen that before. I'm just gonna continue. No, I'm not even gonna fucking bother with that one. He was so interesting that I put him as one of the main characters, by the way, just FYI. We have a badass sassy commander. And she gives no shits. Oh my god, kill me now. She loves coffee and is a caffeine addict. And becomes a total nightmare when she hasn't had it. She becomes like so unmanageable. Which leads to all kinds of different crazy hijinks. Oh joy. Holy fuck, did this turn into a fucking sitcom? What are you doing? Who wrote this? Jesus. Stop it. Yeah, so that leads to all kinds of different funny jokes and totally not a load of fucking bollocks shatter all the time. Totally. Okay, well, let's just move on to the villains, I suppose. They could have been worse. They're obnoxious. They nailed that part. All the kind of interesting and unique traits that a character like Handsome Jack had. You know, all of the wit, any kind of sense of appeal or competence, all of the imaginative insults, all of the snarky and amusing remarks and comments. Well, that's not that. They are essentially parodies of Twitch streamers, or just bloggers in general, I suppose. Mixed with a little bit of reality TV or something like that. Which is totally radical. It will most certainly gel with all the kids nowadays. They will know what we're talking about. With the hip lingos, yes. And the streamers. You know, the writing for Handsome Jack was really interesting because he was absolutely detestable and obnoxious in every single way, but still really freaking appealing and interesting somehow. That's a real feat of writing and character design, I feel. Well, they didn't pull that off again, but it was once in a blue moon, I suppose. So it was probably rather foolish to expect that. What else is there really to talk about? Well, I suppose we can talk about what's actually good in Borderlands 3. Let's do that for a little while. And perhaps what can be good. Or what could be good. Where there is potential. And maybe where there isn't. So let's start with that Borderlands 3 is undeniably the most technically competent Borderlands game to date. The visual presentation is better than it's ever been, and has perhaps rather unsurprisingly seen improvements in graphics, animations and visual effects when compared to the previous titles. It is a newer game after all. But it does nevertheless look better than ever before. As much is hard to argue. Additionally, the combat and gameplay has seen noticeable improvements as well, stemming primarily from better looking and feeling recoil, an expansion to the functions and abilities for weapons and equipment, an increase in the amount of drivable vehicles, improved looking reload animation and dismemberment, a more destructible environment, slightly more open and unconstrained levels, as well as an expanded movement system. All these together in conjunction will of course make for a much more improved and enjoyable experience. You could always say that it wasn't enough or wish for more, but it would be very hard to claim that it hasn't seen an improvement, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I think they did reasonably well here. The story, writing and narrative, on the other hand, well, it's pretty much disgraceful. But that doesn't mean it's bereft of any and all appealing qualities, at least not necessarily. So what do we have? Well, they still manage with some amusing quips and jokes here and there, although it does seem to get increasingly rare. They do also get some interaction and insight into the different companies. I just really wish they'd go a little bit further, because as it stands, the information that's presented is still very much surface level. You have a bit of, hey, this is the guy that founded the company, and this is the guy that runs the company right now, which is fine. Absolutely, tell me about that. But I would also like to know how they work, more like, how are they run, you know? Because it would seem that in the majority of cases, the CEO is a complete moron or absolutely insane, right? Which is fine, okay, but then who runs the company? If you take people like Torge, for example, I have a hard time seeing that he runs the business. So, what does he actually do? How did he establish the company? Is he running the company? Is he managing the business? I don't think so. That would seem very unlikely. Similarly, when you go for example with the example of Handsome Jack, well, he got murdered. But the Hyperion Corporation quite clearly hasn't been particularly distraught by this. They still seem to be doing fine, their weapons are still sold all over the bloody galaxy. I guess someone else took over? But who? And who made that determination? Are they like just public companies? Sold on some kind of intergalactic stock market? I mean, these companies quite clearly drive business all over the galaxy. Are they like publicly traded somewhere? By some people? Do they have investors? Is there a board? Is that how the CEO is determined? How do they work? As far as I'm concerned, this holds great potential for storytelling and world building, but they don't seem to want to utilize it. Maybe they just don't find it interesting. Maybe they don't have a good answer. I don't know. Now you might say, well, it's Borderlands. They don't have to explain any of this shit. Everything is absolutely insane and stupid here. And, well, yeah, maybe, sure. But that's a fair point. But then I also don't care about the characters, so don't try to make a serious story. You see, you can't throw logic out the window, make everything stupid, unexplainable and random, and then expect me to give a shit about the emotional moments. You can't have emotional investment into a world which has no consistency. That's just too tiresome. And spoiler warning here, by the way, which just shouldn't be necessary by this point, but whatever. Lilith losing her powers and Maya dying is quite clearly supposed to evoke emotional reaction. So they certainly seem to have some semblance of serious narrative, but it's very inconsistent. It's very hard to determine exactly what they're going for, but it seems like they might be shooting for a little bit more profound and serious narrative. In which case, fine, great, that's wonderful, but then you have to build the world. You will have to set up certain hard rules within which you have to be confined. You can't have people acting like complete morons, lunatics and idiots, and then expect that very same person to be taken seriously 5 seconds later. You can't have random shit happening all the time. But then I also think that, yes, these companies are very much a big leverage they could use. As far as I'm concerned, there's many intriguing and interesting opportunities for storytelling there, which I would be more than happy to see realized. But as it stands, it's a bit of a mess. It isn't particularly funny, it certainly isn't intriguing, by no means is it emotionally engaging, and the story doesn't really seem to have a greater overarching purpose to begin with. It's just find vaults and open them and don't let the other bad guys get the vaults because they want that power. How exciting. No, it's not. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to have a great story either, but then don't focus on it. Have it one of two ways. Either you do want to focus on the story, in which case you will have to actually, you know, bring something to the table, or ignore it. Screw it. It isn't important. You know, yeah, sure, have a little bit of story just to drive the kind of narrative forwards and get you to the next vault, but then just don't do more than that. It's like it's some kind of weird in-between. On the one hand, we do want to have an emotional and interesting and heartfelt story, but on the other hand, we also have extremely flat characters, stupid jokes, no rules for the universe, and zero stakes because we don't know what the hell can and cannot happen. But the most important thing is just don't make obnoxious characters. I mean, this is a bit of a difficult one. Look, I know that the obnoxious characters are supposed to be funny by being obnoxious. Okay, I get that. And I know that some people do like, for example, Claptrap. They find him absolutely hilarious. Great, that's fine. There is a problem with making obnoxious characters, which is that everybody who do not find that character funny will find him obnoxious. So am I saying strip out all annoying characters? No, I'm not, okay? I'm not saying that. But know that it's kind of risky. If you make this character, some people are probably gonna hate this character. So don't fill the entire game with them, right? Add a few of them, maybe one here and there. In which case, yeah, it will be a bit annoying for the guys who don't like the character, but it's much more manageable when they don't annoy you all the time. It's much less grating. But if you have consistent annoying characters, it becomes migraine-inducing. The last thing I'd like to say is that making completely flawless and uninteresting characters is not fun. If your character doesn't have flaws, if you're just making, oh, it's a badass? No, that's not interesting. Characters that are just supposed to be appealing in every single way ends up being basically the opposite for anybody who wishes for a little bit of complexity in their characters. I don't know why this seems to be somewhat of a trend nowadays. I'm not even gonna mention any names, but I'm pretty sure you can come up with a few yourself. It's so incredibly boring. And I don't think the majority of people really enjoys it either. And what I would like to point to when I say this is that some of the most popular, for example TV series, stars anything but thoroughly good, flawless, good-hearted, heroic characters. What do we have? Breaking Bad? Dexter? The Walking Dead? Squid Game? The guys in those series? Those aren't particularly nice people at all. And they're anything but flawless. That's pretty much it though. That's most of the things I wanted to say. So let's just kinda try to wrap this up, I think. Well, I would be lying if I said that Borderlands 3 is a bad game. Because it isn't. It's very fun to play. The gameplay is better than ever before. It is starting to get a little bit repetitive, yes. But it still holds up. I'm not certain how long that's gonna last. I feel they might need to commit to a little bit more of a major revision and rework for the 4th main entry, assuming there's coming a 4th main entry, that is. For now, it'll do. When it comes to the story, it has been a gradual decline and downhill since the 2nd game, really. The pre-sequel was mostly just a little bit reiterative and uninspired, but I also think I might give it a little bit more leeway because it feels more like a gap bridger as opposed to a main entry. No offense to the pre-sequel team, of course. But by this point, 7 years later, I guess I was hoping for a little bit more. A little bit of an evolvement in the storytelling. Something a bit better as opposed to worse. I guess I was hoping for something a little bit more inspired. At the same time, for me, that's not the purpose of playing Borderlands. It never has been. As to how they will progress in the future? Who knows? The most recent entry, Tiny Tina's Wonderland, released rather recently, probably uses the same engine as Borderlands 3, I would assume. Most likely plays rather similarly as well. Haven't played that one yet, but it seems to have a reasonable enough reception, I suppose. Not including that little hiccup they had by release, of course, which caused a bit of a stir, and rightfully so. I mean, really, stop releasing broken games. And stop buying them as well, by the way. I mean, I know developing games isn't easy, but considering you were fully capable of releasing fully functional games years ago, I don't really understand why you would be unable to do that now. But never mind. Anyways, I suppose there isn't much else to do than just wait and see. I do find it somewhat amusing that I recently saw a video titled The Rise and Fall of Gearbox. Like, holy shit, what is that? What fall? What are you talking about? They're doing fine. Their games are selling no problem. Borderlands 3 has performed very well. And Tiny Tina's Wonderland has, by the majority of reports, sold above expectations. That's a bloody anomaly in the AAA development scene. Gearbox is doing absolutely fine, quite well in fact. Also, fallen as compared to when? Back in the day when they only developed good games and made no bad ones? Like Duke Nukem Forever and Alien Colonial Marines? That old classic? What? Is it some weird nostalgia for Brothers in Arms? If only they'd go back to developing those games, that would be so much better. I don't know. Well, fact of the matter is, Borderlands is the best performing game series they've ever had, so I think they'll do just fine. And I really don't expect to see them fall anywhere anytime soon. In the meantime, I'm still having a decent enough time with Borderlands 3. The gameplay is still fun, and it's certainly not bad if you just want to do some mindless shooting. And yeah, the story is pretty shit for the most part, but I can just ignore it. Maybe listen to some music or a podcast while playing. Yeah, it's not too bad. All things considered. I can live with that. I mean, it's not like it's Mass Effect.